Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 6th of March 2024. I'm actually going to split this video off separately from my geopolitical news because there's quite a lot to cover in both videos, so let's get to it. Okay, we'll start with Ukraine has procured over 350,000 artillery shells themselves from European defence industry. I believe this is over and above the million shells that the Europeans promised to Ukraine. That's how I understand this, even though the Europeans are going to fall. Well, I don't know. There's so much going on at the moment that they could well achieve that 1 million number and some if the Czech initiative works out. But anyway, this was disclosed by EU VP Vice President Josep Borrell, who stated that in addition to ammunition donated and procured by EU states, Ukraine had acquired 350,000 shells via their own contracts. So lots of people are working together to the same end. So the Ukrainians are building or manufacturing their own shells. They're also going out and procuring them by buying those shells using money that they have, often given by other nations to then be spent in those other nations. And then the EU are themselves coming together to procure shells for Ukraine as part of that million shell initiative. Then you got Czechia and France as sort of part of that initiative, finding 800,000 shells from places outside the EU. And then you've got the UK ramping up production, then you've got the US ramping up production, so on and so forth. So, and that's kind of the overall picture. But this could go some way to explaining why some of the counter battery fire and Ukrainian artillery artillery seems to be firing a little more than it was, say, a month ago. But I may be wrong on that. That's just my general intuition from what I'm seeing. And then you have this. So France will join. So remember, Emmanuel Macron went to Prague to visit Czechia and talk to people like Petr Pavel. France will join the Czech initiative to purchase ammunition for Ukraine from outside the EU. So although the French are still talking, and we'll do some discussion on this in a second, still talking about trying to use EU money to buy inside the EU as a sensible economic decision. As a trade bloc, they want to first of all think about their own prosperity before spreading money outside of that bloc. But Ukraine desperately need the ammunition, so Emmanuel Macron has said, okay, we will, just for the time being, go outside the bloc to procure some artillery ammunition to get that, to expedite that to Ukraine. So that's really good they're on board with the Czech initiative there. So no reports of the outcome really of the Czech and French meeting, but focusing on Czechia here. Czechs and Ukrainians are working tirelessly in the Eastern Czech Republic to convert World War II era buildings into an arms and ammunition hub to aid Ukraine. The initiative is part of Europe's response to provide weapons to Ukraine following the delay in US military aid. So you have Europe frantically scrabbling to try and replace the US military aid as quickly as they can. And hats off, they are trying hard. The Czech facility owned by Excalibur Army, so these are the guys who were upgrading the old T-72s for Ukrainian use, as far as I understand it. Anyway, that facility plays a crucial role in refurbishing and supplying arms for Ukraine. So there you go. Meanwhile, a coalition of countries is providing funds for 800,000 artillery shells being sourced through the Czech Republic for Ukraine's short-term needs. Colonel Simon Wooder, chief of the Netherlands Ukraine Task Force, said that countries such as the Netherlands itself, Britain, Canada, Denmark, and Czech Republic, and the United States, among others, are included in this coalition. A senior Czech official said there are about 2 million large caliber ammunition rounds available on the global market. So actually, there's more than 800,000 rounds to be tapped into. This could benefit the direct needs of Ukraine while the EU is still scaling up production. An EU executive expects that the EU will reach a shell production of 1.4 million rounds by the end of 2024, which is almost a tripling of production compared to a year ago. So Europe is doing an amazing job at upscaling. Considering, I mean, you could say it could do it a lot better, a lot quicker, but I talk about this. It's like turning a tanker up, having to build new production facilities. Now, especially in a democratic environment where these nations aren't themselves at war. Okay, it's different. You can go back to World War II and say, well, look, Britain did this. Well, Britain was literally at war at the time of ramping up production. But this is a Europe ostensibly not at war, but trying really hard to replace the US provision, I think, in this case. Um, yeah, it's good news. The challenge for the Europeans is how much of that artillery ammunition is contracted to go outside of the EU. So they are still fulfilling contracts to other people, rightly so. But there are many people who are saying, oh, actually, there needs to be a suspension of provision of artillery ammunition to other people. We need to get it to Ukraine first and foremost, and then fulfill contracts. So that argument will go on, I'm sure. Now, the French are okay. I said yesterday that Emmanuel Macron is positioning himself as a replacement, kind of a replacement for the US president in terms of someone to rally around. Not that anyone was particularly rallying around Biden, but I think there's long been this idea that there needs to be a central focus as a person to rally behind to get aid to Ukraine. And Boris Johnson might have been that person originally, but he's no more in a position to do that. And Rishi Sunak's never going to be that person. And Keir Starmer, when he replaces Rishi Sunak in November, won't be that person either, really, from his whole kind of personality point of view. And also, that's November, and it's too far away. So, although the reason I talk about a British person is because it helps if this person is actually an English speaker, native speaker. It helps being the international language. I've talked about this before. But in the absence of anyone from the US and from UK being able to do that, and with the EU being this big trade bloc that is now super important in defending Ukraine's, or helping to defend Ukraine from an aggressive invader, someone from within the EU, it makes sense for it to be that someone like that. And then you are looking at these different nations. You're wondering, is it going to be a smaller nation, someone like Estonia and Kaja Kallas, or Frederiksen from Denmark, or maybe even Mark Rutte, but then he's outgoing as far as a leader's concerned. Olaf Scholz, that's been highly controversial. He's been highly controversial in terms of the recent leak, but in terms of his position on Taurus, and Germany has been ramping up provision to Ukraine, but Olaf Scholz has been much more divisive. And so you're looking around maybe Giorgia Meloni in Italy, but then she's in a coalition with people who are pro-Russian. So there's just no one that fits the bill. And actually, Emmanuel Macron arguably is the only person that can really step up and do this now. And he probably realizes this himself in terms of his own personal PR. He is kind of safe till 2027 electorally. So this is something that he recognizes as genuinely something that Europe needs to do for its own existential future and survival. Europe needs to, and the EU needs to support Ukraine. Russia is a threat to Ukraine, but it's a threat to Europe. And one of, I think, Putin's intentions is the destruction, essentially, or the disunification of the EU. That's what he wants and what he's always wanted. And for France, the EU is super important. France and Germany, those core members of the EU. And so it makes sense for a large country like France to have their leader be the rallying cry for support for Ukraine. I really get this now. All the dots are joining together. And I think that since the end of last year, there's been a realization within Europe, with the leaders, the main leaders in Europe, that the war in Ukraine is far more serious than they had previously thought, and the Ukrainians were struggling more than they had previously thought, as in the counteroffensive didn't go as well as they would have liked, and then they started losing troops, especially as the US aid provision didn't reach Ukraine. So 5 months of that, and things have got materially worse for Ukraine. So you've got Emmanuel Macron going, okay, something needs to happen here. And it is also useful for me politically and personally. Now, I don't mind about that. Everyone's got their own politics to do. But when it aligns with what the right thing to do is, then, hey, that's a double whammy. So you're then starting to see, French industrial military, the French industrial military complex stand up and say, "Hey, we're here." And also, as a nation, France is the second biggest arms exporter in the world. Okay, so the LRU, the multiple launch rocket system here, of which 4 units have been donated to Ukraine. So Ukraine, like I talked about earlier today, they've lost a HIMARS, but they have a number of similar units from around the world. So at least, well, they've got 4 from France, these LRUs, and they will reach the end of their life in 2027. 600 million euros are allocated for its replacement, with 13 units from 2028 and a final target of 26 units in 2035. The successor should have a range of more than 500 kilometers. Wow. Now, what does that mean for Ukraine? Could Ukraine get hold of a few more LRU going forward, given the replacement schedule? Okay. French aid to Ukraine also reports that if the Ukrainians want more, this is a quote, more GM200 radars, 2, 3, 4, 5, we know how to organize. So the CEO of Thales Group, the French defense manufacturer, is coming out and saying, hey, like, all you need to do is say you want them, give us some money, and we'll give them. That's what, we know how to organize this. Hey, we can build stuff if people pay us. And there's going to be an awful lot of defense contract or defense concerns that are going to be saying exactly the same. The problem is for the Americans is that without those aid packages coming through Congress, their own arms producers are going to miss out. Now, this is really relevant for where I'm taking this at the moment. So this is how the military strategy and the industrial strategy and economic strategy of any country are actually entwined. And one of the criticisms of Europe going back, although this is people who voted leave for Brexit were very much against this. But there are certain people in Europe that are saying you cannot have an economic strategy and industrial strategy that doesn't take into account a military strategy. And if we are a political union as much as we are an economic union, which is what the EU has become, then we need to be considering a unified military strategy. And if we're going to be doing that, what does that mean in terms of having an EU army? Like, we've got a NATO army, we've got a UN peacekeeping force, right? What's the difference in having, like, we're all members of this group? Why is it categorically different from the UN military, and so on and so forth? So there's this big call. There has been this big debate over whether there should be an EU army, and you can look at maybe what an EU army would guarantee peace within the EU much more than not having one, right? Okay, so it could keep, for example, or it might not, I don't know, but it could keep, say, Slovakia, say Hungary, more in line with EU values, considering they'd be integrated within a military framework. So anyway, all those ideas are relevant for where I'm going. Okay, so let's go then back to Czech president here, Petr Pavel, reportedly calls to continue a discussion on sending Western troops to Ukraine. So Petr Pavel has said that he's in favour of looking for new ways to support Ukraine, including potentially sending troops for non-combat engagement, according to Czech media yesterday. Now, some of the Western media sources are having a go at even Kyiv Independent, saying like Macron's on his own, he's like on his lonesome, since he's talked about this and put the idea out there. Actually, it hasn't garnered that much support, and he's on his own. Well, I'm not sure, because we've heard Canada saying the same, we've heard Czechia saying the same, we've heard some of the Baltic nations saying the same. So I'm not sure about that, and I think this is massively important for allowing this to be discussed, allowing the idea to be out there to normalize us to the idea of Western troops having non-combat roles in Ukraine, which I think is really important. Right. We need to look for new opportunities for assistance, as mentioned, in particular discussing the possible presence of those troops in Ukraine, says Pavel. Okay, where there is, quote, there is a whole range of possibilities. The discussion has been launched. If we want to prevent Russia from succeeding in Ukraine, we cannot be satisfied with the support that is available today. We should not limit ourselves where we do not have to limit ourselves. This is what Macron was saying as well. So these two are singing off the same song sheet here by saying, like, if we say we are definitely not going to send troops to Ukraine, then we might get to a position where that will bite us on the backside. Oh, we promised we're not going to send troops to Ukraine, but actually we really need to do that. Things have changed and we need that option open. But if we shut that option off for us, then we are only constraining ourselves and we're only giving an advantage to Russia, who doesn't give a monkey's ass about anything like that. So they can do what they like. If we're kind of going, oh, we can do this, but we can't do that. And, oh, Ukraine can have these missiles, but they can't fire them into Russia. And they can do this, but they can't do that. Russia are laughing all the way to the Kremlin, right? So Putin's just sitting back, smoking a pipe and going, those Europeans with their little rules they make for themselves. So, okay, what are Russia doing? Well, what do we need to do? We need to allow ourselves all the options. So we're not saying we are going to do this, and we're not saying it's going to happen next week. But the Western allies of Ukraine, or allies of Ukraine, should not limit themselves to what they might be able to do in the future. So the Czechia president told today discussed with the French president the purchase of shells for Ukraine as well. The discussion concerned 500,000 155 mils and 300,000 122 mil shells, for which 1.5 billion is needed. Most of that, I think, has now been raised. I would have thought we're at about 60%. I think France and Germany are coming on top of that, so I'm fairly sure that's going to be on the way to being done. But then, as mentioned, instead of there being 800,000, there could well be 2 million. Right, let's listen to what, or in fact, you're going to listen to me say, I won't do my French accent. C'est bon ça. Très bien. I'm not going to do that because it will be embarrassing. I've just embarrassed myself already. But Emmanuel Macron here saying all the right things again. We have to be aware that this war is affecting us. And we never want, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, and we never want to see things as they are, but we have to be lucid. It's been 2 years now that we've been repeating press conferences, war is back on European soil. It's been 2 years since we revealed the extent of materials already delivered, the financial support already provided. Translation's a little bit dodgy with some of the finer elements here, but is it our war or isn't it our war? Can we turn away? Consider that things can continue to play out. I don't think so. And so it's a strategic awakening, which I called upon, and which I fully assume we have to be lucid about the reality of the situation in Europe, the risks that are at stake, and what we have to take on. I'm convinced that the clarity of these statements is what Europe needed. But you should go ask President Putin what he's prepared not to do. Who initiated the war in Ukraine? Vladimir Putin. Who is threatening? Whatever we do, whatever we say, with nuclear weapons. President Putin. Everyone turns to him to know what his strategic boundaries are. But if every day we explain what our limits are to someone who has none, exactly what I was just saying, and started this war, I can already tell you that the spirit of defeat is lurking out there. I absolutely, not here, he says. I absolutely agree with this because that's exactly what I was saying. Like, if he's just saying, look, if we limit ourselves, we're going to lose. Putin's not limiting himself. He's threatening nuclear weapons. He's doing this. He's doing that. And if we limit ourselves, we hand the advantage to Putin. Now, Michael Weiss says broadly of what Macron has said, whatever they're putting in his beef bourguignon lately, double the dose. Because Macron has really turned up to the party, hasn't he? He is being this strong leader, or at least presenting himself as this strong leader. And I think, as I said, Europe needs this. Ukraine needs this. And, better at him than no one, right? Somebody has to step up. Right, French foreign minister. So this is not just about Macron positioning himself and it being all about him. It's about France's strategy. It's about the European strategy, and we'll come on to this in a second. And about, as I was saying, the the existential future of the EU. French Foreign Minister Stéphane Séjourné emphasized the critical need for European firmness in the face of the ongoing threat posed by Russia. He highlighted the severe consequences for France and Europe if Ukraine were to fall. Yes, expressing concerns at the European Union's ability to come to an agreement. Séjourné stressed the importance of supporting Ukraine, stating that Putin aims to test solidarity among European nations. Yes, and urged avoiding such a scenario by maintaining alliances, making bilateral agreements, and providing significant assistance to Ukraine. Yes. Now, Thomas Tyner then points out that as French aid to Ukraine has stated, well, okay, what's the first thing here? So France and Estonia have led the call for the EU to issue bonds to fund the weapons production industry, the same way the Commission did to finance the EU post-pandemic €800 billion fund. So what Thomas Tyner here is saying, quite rightly, this would be excellent. €1 trillion for European and Ukrainian defence boosts European industry, saves Ukraine, keeps Russia at bay, and puts 500,000 people in jobs. Do it. So this gets back to this. I mean, this is a suggestion at the moment that you could sell bonds that can raise money for a large-scale industrial strategy. In other words, a kind of ramping up to on almost like a quasi-war footing, industrial war footing in Europe to support Ukraine. Because if that doesn't happen, Ukraine will lose. Putin will take over half of Ukraine or whatever, and European unity will be further affected. And Russia will continue to be able to affect democratic institutions and processes in the Western world through disinformation campaigns. It all can be linked back to the successful failure with the war in Ukraine. Now, this is a suggestion that, look, it's been done for COVID and it worked, and we raised a load of money and we tackled a global pandemic and we did a pretty good job. I know there's lots of controversy, but really, if you see how the world changed like that, how you had schools operating from home, how you got industry working in this way, how you got this happening and that happening, it is basically a blueprint for being able to react very quickly, if needs be, to a threat. So Thomas Tyner is rightfully saying, "What this is a good idea from France and Estonia." And again, this is the idea that you've got a military, an industrial, and an economic and political strategy intertwined. So then we move on to this. The EU's new defence industrial strategy published today is very radical, says Shashank Joshi of The Economist. Quote, by 2030, EU countries should buy at least 40% of the defence equipment by working together, spend at least half of their defence procurement budget on products made in Europe. Now, this is massive, and I'll tell you what, the Americans are going to be looking at this as well. Now, the problem for the Americans is that, one, they've got the biggest, they are the biggest arms exporter in the world, so they're the number one arms exporter, and if Europe are then saying, we're going to do this, then that is going to hurt the US economy and the US arms industry. Now, the US arms industry would desperately be wanting that funding to go through Congress to get aid to Ukraine, because this enables them to sell stuff. HIMARS have been advertised to the world to the point where HIMARS are going off the shelf quicker than they can build them, right? They are in huge demand worldwide. Now, if the EU are saying, well, we can't rely on, because part of this strategy will be looking at what's happened in Congress over the last 5 months and saying, well, we're not sure how readily we can rely on the US if stuff like this happens. We need to be self-sufficient in the same way that you look at like energy independence in terms of what's happened in Russia with hydrocarbons, and Europe is saying, right, we need to get off dependence on them, but at the same time we need to move away from dependence on the US. Now, if you go back to Emmanuel Macron, one thing he's been saying over the last year is we need to move away from US dependency. Now, you've got the isolationists in the US saying, yes, that they need to pay their own fair share. They need to pay more as a percentage of GDP to be members of NATO, blah, 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 blah. But as I've long said, the US exports security, right? And so even if there are European nations who have not been paying enough into NATO, there is still a net benefit to the US. So NATO is still a massive net benefit because they get trade deals off the back of it. They get arms exports off the, so on and so forth. Now, if they're going to pay more as a percentage of their GDP into defense, then the Americans might think, yep, that's brilliant because they're going to buy our stuff. But then at the same time, because it's now we're going to, okay, you want us to be independent of the US, we'll be economically, industrially, and militarily independent of the US. And actually that is a move away from what the US will want. And I did a whole segment, a massive segment of a video on this recently, which is there are arguments for and against US dependency from both points of view. So from a European point of view, being dependent on the US means that we don't have to pay so much money, and the US kind of still continues spending inordinate amounts of money on their military. And they get a benefit out of that because they then export that security to us. Okay, we'll do that, but it's all part of their industrial economic strategy. Okay, so right, then you get certain Americans will say, no, actually, you guys need to pay more. But then that means we're going to get dependency, which means we won't need you so much, which means your sales will go down. Your industrial, economic, military strategy has to adapt to the fact that we aren't so reliant on you. And that will have an economic impact. Even though you might think, oh, they have to spend more than us. But actually, as part of what they do anyway, your entire economy is based on that. And that kind of feeds into itself. So yeah, you're spending money, but you're spending money on your own troops and on your own people and facilities and so on and so forth. So and it's contracts and money and tax and etc. etc. And so as soon as Europe stands up on its own 2 feet more and more, the US industrially will suffer. So Shashant Joshi says the quote, buy 50% of EU by 2030 would have potentially drastic implications for many EU member states who are buying or planning to buy British, European, Asian or hybrid kit, F-35, Typhoon, HIMARS, Apache, GCAP, Tempest, beyond that. And this will affect the UK as well because we're not part of the EU. So them buying our like BAE systems, this is why things like BAE systems will get involved in having elements. MBDA, for example, has Germany, UK, Italy, France elements. So multinationals will set up within the EU, and then I'm sure that will qualify as spending within the EU. But nonetheless, this will have an effect on outside entities like the British and the US and the Americans. The strategy says that 50% of member states' defence procurement should be within the EU by 2030 and a remarkable 60% by 2035. But he goes on to say, hard for me to see why, say, Poland would agree to this if it, as he sees it, is it would be a gutting of their rearmament and modernisation plans that would be required by this. So Poland has just committed to spending an absolutely staggering amount of money on US equipment. They have bought a ton of HIMARS. They bought a whole load of American stuff. Poland are arming themselves up big time, and they're spending most of it, although a lot of it does go to South Korea. But again, this is a point Shashin Joshi is making, that actually that will have to change. Now, although Poland has done that, actually going forward they might be cool with buying within Europe, especially if their own arms industry can contribute to that. And it's the economic benefit to doing that as long as the kit is good enough. And that's the question. Thomas Tyner's been talking a lot about this over the last 48 hours, saying, well, actually, F-35 is better than any of the planes that the Europeans can make, and HIMARS is better than any of this stuff, and so on and so forth. So there will be this issue, but then that will mean that European defence manufacturers, such as MBDA, such as Rheinmetall, and so on and so forth, will have to just up their game in terms of the quality of the stuff they're producing. And also, if you're having to buy within Europe, it means that the unit sales for, say, Leopard 2A7 are going to go up because you have to buy within Europe, so you're going to buy the Leopard 2A7, which means the unit cost of those comes down as economies of scales kick in. So this is one of the arguments against buying, say, from Rheinmetall compared to, say, South Korea, because South Koreans can make pretty much the same tank for a lot cheaper. Well, actually, this European strategy might aid European defense industries by reducing the unit cost by upping the sales. But bad news for US companies and their shareholders, but it's now time to awaken the military industrial giant in the EU, says probably a Dutch person here. Shashank Joshi comes back and says, someone please explain to me why Poland would agree to gutting their modernization plans to meet this target. Someone else random says, because the US is no longer a reliable supplier. I called Colby Badwa out on this, who said that smashed together the idea that the US are reliable in selling arms and therefore they're reliable as an ally. Selling arms is totally different to the government giving arms in military aid packages. That's an equivocation. It's a fallacy of false equivalence, actually. So the US can be unreliable as a political partner, but very reliable as an economic partner, or as someone you buy stuff off, because money talks, right? But anyway, Ukrainians during the war migrated to mainly US weapons platforms, only to find out that they have their ammo and spare parts cut off due to US border squabble. Who can guarantee that this won't happen in the future? Simple, they're not. It's procurement, so means all new orders, says someone to Shashank Joshi. So actually, it won't. The argument might be that it won't affect Poland too much because it's all about what they buy going forward, not about what they have bought. This is designed to get the US arms industry all over Republican congressmen to stop that price must go Mike from cock blocking aid to Ukraine. Okay, sorry to use that language, just reading that out. Okay, so someone then suggesting that this strategy could also be used as a way of getting the industrial military complex in the US to massively pressure Republican Congress people so that they actually change their activities, their behavior, and vote through that aid. Right, sorry, I had to take a phone call and I have totally forgotten where I was, but you get the idea that there is a movement from within Europe to work its economic and industrial strategy with its military and political strategy to get it to be more self-sufficient. And here's an interesting example. The Swedish company Saab has received an order from the Ministry of Defense of Poland for the supply of Carl Gustaf M4 hand grenade launchers worth $1.25 billion US. So it's a huge procurement there from Poland, but within the EU. So this could be sensible for the EU for many, many reasons, as long as mentioned, they can ensure that the very best equipment is able to be manufactured. But if the 60% needs to come from the EU, that allows 40% outside of the EU. So you know what? If you need F-35s, because no one can make planes to that level of technology in the EU, then hey, you get your F-35s from the US still. I wonder what the US response to this will be. Right, okay, moving on. Bulgaria is taking out of conservation, so out of some very old storage units, I guess, 122 mil self-propelled howitzers, the 2S1 Grodzika, and the BRDM2. So these are old Soviet pieces of kit that actually haven't already been sort of done up and sent to Ukraine, so they still have some stockpiles of this stuff. According to Bulgarian photographer, military equipment is intended for the Ukrainian armed forces. Quote, military equipment of the Bulgarian army from the deep military reserve in the district is going to Ukraine, he said. So good news for Ukraine. 3rd Tank Brigade has received a new bridge-laying tank, the Biber, and demonstrated its capabilities in this video. Germany has delivered a total of 15 of these to Ukraine, most recently one at the end of January 2024. 11 more will be delivered to Ukraine in the future. These are obviously very useful, but you need to have a safe area to do this. It's quite difficult if you're in, say the the Russian situation at the moment, where they have got to Orlivka and Tonyenka, and they need to cross that river. Well, if the Ukrainians are just the other side of that river, then you're not going to be able to use one of these bits of kit to just slack down a bridge. So don't mind us, we're just going to do this. Can you give us a couple of hours? Don't fire at us, please, and plonk that down. So, you know, these aren't the sort of bits of kit, I would imagine, I don't know, that can be used particularly close to the front line, but still like super important. That said, if you can like lay those bridges over like small ravines and whatnot, it really relatively quickly, then maybe they are useful close to the front line. Indeed, they are. There is example of the Ukrainians here using. Okay, it's an ARV, not an engineering vehicle, but a recovery vehicle. But this is the 3rd Assault Brigade evacuating with the help of a Panzer II, so that's what the Germans have provided as well, a damaged Russian T-72 in the area of the Avdiivka coke plant. So I don't know when this is from, but a Russian helicopter, as claimed the Ka-52, is working on them. So they do use these ARVs and similar very, very close to particularly hot areas. So, you know. Right, moving on. Drones. The Defence Procurement Agency, the Ministry of Defence, will purchase 20,000 DJI Mavic 3 drones, a very prominent drone in this war, through the Prozoro system for the first time. The total expected cost is almost 3 billion hryvnias. The deadline for delivery is May the 31st, 2024. There's just so many drones being produced and delivered to both Russia and Ukraine. The DJI, the Chinese drones, I'm sure, are working for both sides. Now, I thought this was an interesting little snippet and something that I've thought about before, which is the kind of organization that needs to exist around the use of drones. Drones are now an integrated weapon, I guess, inside all these units. There's been these talks about, like Andrew Perpetua had a big discussion on this, I don't know, like a month or so ago, talking about whether you should have separate drone units that operate as like standalone units, or whether you should integrate drones into each infantry unit, mechanized unit, so on and so forth. And the end result of that discussion was, well, his opinion was both, right? You need like separate, like Magyar's drone people doing like mental stuff with their drones, but also every unit needs a drone. So here, a set of 20 like pre-prepared FPV drones at a Ukrainian position, a minimum that each FPV unit must have ready for an enemy assault. So really fascinating stuff. So these drones are ready to go. It's not like, oh, we need to use a drone, let's build one up now, let's go and use it. It's like, we need all these drones and we need at least 20 in case we're attacked. And if we're attacked, that's like, you know, having a mortar ready with 200 like mortar rounds, right? We got 200 mortar rounds. Okay, when we're ready for a Russian attack or more, whatever it is. Here it's like 20 FPV drones are needed, and then you got your reconnaissance drones and other things as well. So I just thought that was an interesting little snippet. Now, a pretty nice D20 howitzer. These are old school howitzers being made here by Ukrainian volunteers. So the volunteers have gone and made a howitzer for the Ukrainian army there. So that's quite incredible. Now, I presume that's not, see there, that looks very much like a fake, so a decoy. But yeah, I presume that's just a model for it or something, that this is a real one. Yeah. So, it's somebody's a nice looking decoy. So maybe it is just a decoy. But nonetheless, yeah, because getting hold of a barrel is going to be pretty difficult. But whether it's a decoy or, yeah, that's definitely a decoy there, you can see. Either way, you know, it's really useful that Ukrainian volunteers are doing this in the same way that they are building drones as well for frontline usage. Now, talking of drones, tests of the new version of the Ukrainian Sea Baby, something that's very prominent at the moment with the sinking of the Sergei Kotov ship. Naval drone with a new hull design. As said, the new model can carry up to 10 centers of explosives over distances of up to 1,000 kilometers, but the possibilities of using marine drones of this model will not be limited only to the use of the kamikaze role. It's said that the design of the drone allows the installation of modules for firing at enemy coastal targets. There's also said to be the possibility of installing air defense systems on the platform. This is what I talked about yesterday, and I think this is quite incredible. And yeah, first of all, I mean, it's just a powerful speedboat that can do all the things a powerful speedboat can do. But if it's modular, you can whack on some kind of man pad thing. If you think what's on top of, say, the Avenger, so the Humvee, the Avenger system is a Humvee with like 2 pods of 4 Stinger man pads, man portable air defense systems, and that's on top of a Humvee. Well, this boat could maybe have a pod of 4 Stingers, and then you send it near to the Russian coast and you shoot down some helicopters or jets or whatever. Absolutely fantastic. Or put some kind of heavy machine gun system on it, or some ATGMs, anti-tank guided missile systems, and go up to a Russian port at night. You've got 10 of those with ATGMs. Go up to Novorossiysk or go up to Sevastopol and just lob in some ATGMs to blow up some Russian stuff. I mean, the options for these, the options are endless. No, it's just really good news that the Ukrainians are creating these things. Now, what you've always got to worry is that when the Ukrainians create them, the Russians can create this as well. What are they doing in terms of naval drones? We have seen a few hints of them previously, but nothing on this scale at the moment. Talking about scale of drones, this is massively worrying. So the Russian and Ukrainian Telegram channels are sharing this video of Russia's Shahid Garan loitering munition production plant in Yelabuga region. Both daytime and nighttime Garan drone versions are visible. So the Garan is what the Russians call their own version of the Shahid. Now, this is a factory that is, I mean, those are drones. They have been built or in the process of being finished off or whatever. They don't have the warheads on those ones, but that's a lot of drones. Now, okay, you might say that's 100 drones, so I don't know, or I don't know, maybe fewer, maybe more, I don't know, but maybe that's just 2 nights worth of drones and that's taken a month to build. I don't know, but it's always worrying when you see that many bits of kit ready to go. And obviously that's going to be some kind of a PR video that's going to be used to elicit that kind of response. But it is worrying that their production capacities appear to be ramping up for making their own, rather than having to rely on Iran to get them to Ukraine. So yeah, a worry. You would assume that the Ukrainians would be wanting to target that establishment. And then just talking about Russian procurement of human beings. So here's a story of 7 Indian citizens. I mean, it's a story, this is literally them telling you it. So 7 Indian citizens published a video message in which they said they were being forced to fight for Russia in Ukraine. So this is fascinating, doesn't surprise me at all. So this is how they've ended up fighting for the Ukrainians. They allegedly came to Russia to celebrate the new year at the end of December 2023. Then, according to them, the travel agent suggested they also visit Belarus, to which they agreed. Quote, "We didn't know we needed a visa." So they were, and I don't know whether this is a travel agent like knowingly telling them to go to Belarus but not telling them to get a visa, or whether this is just some BS excuse for them ending up in the war or whatever. But interesting. So they were advised to go to Belarus. Oh yeah, we'll go and visit Belarus. But when we arrived in Belarus, they say, the agent asked us for money and then disappeared. So it turns out they didn't have a visa, they weren't told, and that got them in trouble. After this, they were detained by the police and handed over to the decision makers who forced them to sign documents. Since these documents were written in Russian, Indian citizens didn't understand the meaning but still signed. They were explained that the alternative to military service in the Russian army could be imprisonment for 10 years. So you either have military service, you're not here, you don't have a visa for being here, you're in trouble, you're going to be detained, you're either going to go to prison for 10 years or you're going to have some military service. Now we are forced to fight in this war against Ukraine, they say. They received military training for 15 days and were sent to a combat zone. Absolutely incredible. Now, is this 100% true as a representation of what happened? I have no idea. You'd expect the Indian embassy to be getting involved here for sure, but maybe not. Maybe they've got other things to do. Anyway, this kind of situation allows the Russians to recruit human beings to throw at their problems. There was talk recently about how a number of the troops going into places like, I think, Avdiivka were lacking in military training, and indeed in equipment largely. There's talk about not, going in without helmets and body armor and so on and so forth. So I don't know how true these rumors end up being, but there is something else to throw into the mix. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Let me know what you think about, again, my speculations concerning European defense strategies and where that leads the US, and whether the Congress has ended up shooting the US in the foot, shooting themselves in the foot, whether those Republican lawmakers have actually made or helped facilitate a situation whereby the industrial military concerns in the US are going to be losing out. I don't know. Let me know. Take care. Speak soon.